I suppose a couple of announcements. You know, we are accepting fall enrollments now into our Evolutionary Astrology course. We have started also our live monthly webinars and classes for those associates to join us by buying course materials of that EA course. You can go to the astrology courses page of the website for more information. Choose your right format. Go ahead and get your materials. We just recently posted Sun Square the Nodes in the Registered Associates area, and I think we got one coming up next October. I don't have the date in front of me, but mid-month. It's always the third Tuesday of the month for associates classes here at EAN. So a couple of program notes there, and we appreciate you joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kim Marie.
All right, thank you. I'm going to start my recording now. Oops, didn't actually. Welcome everyone to Jupiter in Scorpio, and our part 1 is the archetypes. And for any of you who listen to the recording of this webinar after the fact, it is being recorded October 2nd of 2017. The day after the massacre in Las Vegas. And so prepping today was a little bit of a heavy heart and an intensity of going, geez, Jupiter's in Scorpio already, giving us a little major insight into what we may have ahead. I'll speak more to this as we go along for you tonight. First of all, though, the housekeeping slide. Here at the Evolutionary Astrology Network, you can study EA with us 3 different ways. Leroy and I, as Media Monk and Star Lady, have a free weekly audio podcast that you can get from our website that you see below on your screen. We have 3 sections to our Astro Library that you can subscribe 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, or do a monthly recurring. And we have 3 segments to our Evolutionary Astrology course, as you can see on your screen. If you'd like more information, you're always welcome to contact us at evolutionaryastrology.net, or the phone number on the screen, 605-348-5111. Briefly, the archetype of Jupiter. It is the principle of growth and expansion, just as its planetary pair Saturn is the principle of decay and many times death. Jupiter and its sign Sagittarius and its house, 9th house, is also the archetype of natural laws and cosmological understandings of the universe. In other words, religious and spiritual philosophies, how we try to make sense of this phenomenal world in a larger, broader perspective. And so this archetype will bring in what we call our right brain, where we know something without quite knowing how we know it. We tap into those larger forces of the universe and bring it into our own brain on a direct conscious level. So Jupiter is also then that intuition and that 6th sense. The 6th sense being beyond the 5 physical senses. Again, all of those intuitive hits that you might get. Because this is the archetype of growth and expansion, it also brings in the teacher, and with understanding of broader principles, it can bring in the guru under religious and spiritual principles. My quote from Jeffrey Wolf Green that I always leave in here: the fundamental laws or principles are the same for all individuals or cultures, but are conceived, conceptualized, and expressed in a diversity of cultural and individual ways. Jupiter is the archetype of the future. When we look at growing and expanding, it has us moving, and it has us moving forward, and there's where the future comes in. It's also well known as being honesty versus lies, integrity principles versus exaggeration and storytelling. You know, the fish you caught gets bigger and bigger and bigger every time you tell the story. It is authenticity versus compensating. Sometimes if we can't stand in that truth, we'll compensate. We won't want to raise anybody's ire, so we'll just kind of slide a little this way or slide a little that way, or stand in, you know, a little bit less than who we totally are, because again, not wanting to ruffle feathers, being not courageous enough to just really stand up and this is me in my truth, take it or leave it. Alienations are Jupiter archetype, and many times when we get alienated from society, in traditional astrology, Jupiter and Saturn are the social planets. They're how we go from the personal planets to the outer planets. They're the social planets that work all of the social means that we're always dealing with in our world, how we start to reach out there and interact with those that are beyond family or friends or intimacy. And many times with this archetype, we can get rejected, alienated. And the purpose of that is to help us figure out who we are versus who we are not in regards to that truth versus lies lesson that we're always going back and forth in. So sometimes we're not going to fit into the group. We're not going to fit in socially. We're going to be alienated. And that turning inward helps us understand who we really authentically are on a deeper or broader level. Jupiter also includes integration and assimilation lessons. We can't just be exposed to more. We have to be able to understand it, know what it means, and integrate it into us. In health and wellness astrology, Jupiter is literally the ability to assimilate the food that we eat. Jupiter rules the liver. The liver is so busy processing out toxins and then helping us turn things into energy. The liver is an organ that, I'm going to lose track of the number, but something like over 100 biological functions in the body. So it's constantly working and helping us assimilate or detoxify. And Jupiter, along with its polarity, Mercury, Gemini, third house, is lessons of language and communication. Jupiter is more that right brain concept of language, and then being able to find the specific words in which another can hear and understand what we are actually saying. So many times, a lot of Jupiter, Sag, or ninth house qualities in the chart can be someone who has excellent speaking skills, or if they don't have good speaking skills, then this is something that they are learning with a lot of that archetype. Something else with Jupiter, which we will definitely experience or have example of in this webinar, is Jupiter will sometimes bring lessons of loss. Saturn, just like Jupiter is growth, Saturn's decay, they can interchange that back and forth with each other. Jupiter can't expand into something unless there's space or void created to expand into. So Jupiter can bring lessons of loss as well as lessons of excess and going overboard and eating the whole bag of potato chips. But this lesson of loss or something being released is not always explored with Jupiter Sag 9th house on popular levels. And as we look at Jupiter's transit through Scorpio, and I forgot to mention it for the sake of the tape, Jupiter goes into Scorpio October 10th, 2017 through November 8th, 2018. And now I lost my thought of what I was as we go through the annual transit, the year-long transit of Jupiter through Scorpio, many of us will probably become a lot more familiar with how Jupiter can bring loss and death. That is an archetype to Scorpio, as we'll see here coming up. But together, Jupiter in this transit through Scorpio, we could become quite familiar with the whole concept of death, dying, and rebirth. So, just like it was in Libra, just like it is in any sign, Jupiter takes everything to excess and extreme. And here in Scorpio, it's going to continue to do it in relationships just like it did with Libra. And it can go to those extremes in relationships, both good and bad. We'll work with some examples of this coming through. I always like to put up when Jupiter had previous cycles in any archetype. So here are the last, gosh, what would this be? 80 years of Jupiter in Scorpio or somewhere thereabout. So you can see actual dates when it would go in and out, and you can see over here on your right-hand side when we had those year-long passages. So of course, if you were born between these dates, for instance, as you are seeing them here on your screen, you will have Jupiter in Scorpio natally. So everything we say here tonight for anyone who has Jupiter in Scorpio in their birth chart, all of this stuff impacts you. And all of it comes cycling around to be magnified again, to work through the themes again as we look at Jupiter's transit through Scorpio and you having a Jupiter in Scorpio routine. I don't have Jupiter in Scorpio, but for instance, if you remember just before what was it, the end of August 2005, we had the Hurricane Katrina. Isn't it interesting? 12 years later, here we are with hurricanes again. This cycle to go back, this was a cycle where I was just letting go of my environmental politics days because I was so far in debt. Jupiter and Scorpio couldn't afford it to do it anymore. I had to come back and get a mundane job in 1993. Cycle before this, I was divorced in 1983. And right here was where my first marriage in my middle 20s was falling apart. This cycle, I was a little too young. I can't really quite remember anything. I would have been junior high. But for instance, you can just do a little bit of reflection here on your own and see where these previous transits may have been active in your chart. And again, everything we work through for you natal Jupiter and Scorpios, these are your themes, the rest of the slides. I always like to do this breakdown for any newer students. In evolutionary astrology, we will look at the planet ruling a sign and archetype as being one interchangeable archetype. There's 12 archetypes in the zodiac. Mercury and Venus both ruling 2 signs, 2 houses. And so when you can break that down into those 12 archetypes and learn them, then you can extrapolate it out to a planet or a sign or a house. And when we are learning the beginnings of an archetype, and we divide the circle by 2, we have polarities. When we divide the circle of 12 by 3, we have modalities. When we divide the circle of 12 by 4, we have elements. And by the way, if you are a real beginner, we did do a series on this, which you can find on our website under educational webinars. So we can see that Jupiter is active polarity, mutable modality, and the element of fire. As it moves into Scorpio, we're going to be working through a passive polarity, a fixed modality, and a water element. Nothing matches up. Everything is different. If we look at the polarities, active and passive, there's only 2. So it creates that back and forth energy. The passive energy of Scorpio is going to want to slow down any Jupiter expansions for security reasons. The active polarity of Jupiter is going to build up pressure to be released. With the modalities, the mutable modality is going to want to make changes faster than that fixed energy of Scorpio. And so the compromise is that change must make sense. Water is always senses, and it must feel secure. Water needs a container before taking action. So just the basics of recognizing, as I am growing and evolving over the next year, it's going to have an emotional flavor for it. And I'm going to be feeling my way through. I'm going to be working with my senses a lot more than trying to make it be okay before I move into it. We'll watch how this can really build up pressure for Jupiter, Scorpio with this fixed modality as we go through some of these slides. And then when we get to the element, we have fire and water. Well, we know what happens here. Water puts out the fire, and fire heats water and creates steam, and it boils over. And so there has to be compromises between these 2 elements of water and fire so that both can have a chance to act, to be, to evolve. Jupiter evolution. So it will sometimes require courage to make changes and do something new. Fire is that sense of special destiny. It's spirit. It's the spark. And when we have that fixed water of Scorpio, passive fixed water of Scorpio, this is a Scorpio word as well as a few other archetypes, but we have to have courage and will to the depth of our soul in moving forward. So if you're a beginner to astrology in general, you can take all 12 archetypes and you can break them down to their polarities, modalities, and elements. And this will really help you then understand how any single archetype will work, how they blend together. Jupiter in Scorpio. Scorpio and its 8th house, and both ruled by Pluto, represents the soul, that immutable consciousness, unconsciousness that exists from lifetime to lifetime beyond the body. And so this archetype represents the soul on both an individual and a collective level. And within the soul, there is what evolutionary astrology calls the dual desire nature. We have first a desire to separate from that which created us, or the desire to incarnate into a physical body if we're human or animal or even plant. Now, what's that separating desire? In natural law, this is anything and everything. desire to have a new job, a new lover, to have clothing and resources and a car and a place to live, and all of these things that we can sometimes be made to feel guilty about when we have them in excess. And also, though, in natural law, is that every soul goes through countless lifetimes exhausting the separating desire nature. And this is different. This contrasts with what religions teach. Religions teach that false belief that we can somehow pray ourselves perfect. We can deny that desire for sexuality unless it's procreating. We can, pretend that we don't need this or we don't need that, and then wonder why it becomes this secret obsession in our life. And then all of a sudden the secret of it is exposed, and it's put out there for all to see. Again, this is the distortions of many religions that deny that there's any senses below the neck. And as we learn to recognize that these separating desires is the path that we take to evolve and exhaust the desires, it doesn't give us carte blanche to go out and do anything and everything, but it does help us understand why we're here, why we have this desire to have a long-term intimate partner if we've not been successful with that yet. And so letting go of a lot of the judgments around these separating desires and just go, this is something that's really important to me. My soul desires it. I will create this. And as time goes by, we have the desire, we create it, we exhaust it, we replace it with another desire, create it, exhaust it. And eventually it starts to become that, been there, done that. Isn't there something else to all of this? And so this is when the other opposite desire comes in, the desire to return to that which created us, or the desire to know universal source, God, Goddess, Great Spirit, the big kahuna, whatever you want to call it. There really is only one returning desire, and that is to know source. And in natural law, these two desires interplay with each other. This is going to be a real expansion of understanding with Jupiter and Scorpio. Just think about it. How many of you who participate in this webinar want to know source, want to lead a spiritual life, want to have some spiritual practices in your world, but you're not sitting off on a Himalayan mountaintop. You're in the world. You are having to go to your job to have money to eat. And so it's recognizing that interplay. And as the returning desire becomes stronger and stronger, we realize that these separating desires are still things that we fulfill and exhaust, but they're not the be-all, end-all substitute for source anymore. They're just the mechanism of moving through and evolving on our spiritualization path. For instance, Scorpio, which is the archetype of merging sexuality with another. In natural law, the last separating desire that we exhaust is sexuality. Only 1 to 2% of souls on the planet have naturally exhausted the desire for sex. A, procreation of the species, survival of the species. And then B, it is the last thing to let go of that, again, can actually get us here. And so trying to then pretend via religion that, you know, deny sexuality, a religion forcing its, you know, spiritual leaders to be celibate, well, look how that's worked out in a few religions. If we suppress something that's natural, it gets distorted and it comes back at us in distorted ways. And so spiritual principles that embrace sexuality, even to the point of sacred sexuality, as sexuality as a means to spiritualize, to form that sacred union, merging with another one-on-one, is that path of merging with Source. So Jupiter in Scorpio is going to expose all of these deep dual desires within us. We may release some, we may have some new separating desires come through, we may have that returning desire strengthening and becoming more and more conscious through Jupiter in Scorpio. Jupiter in Scorpio is where we are going to be facing some of our greatest emotional fears. Water is emotions, element of water. And reaching for deeper levels of self-reliance, that Taurus polarity of Scorpio, and reaching for these deeper levels of self-reliance through realigning with a greater source of power. And this greater source of power may be of a separating or returning nature. As I said, for some of us, we may have a deepening of that desire to know Source. However, just like we have dual desires, separating desires, returning desires, there are larger forces in the universe that exist outside of ourselves that we will call the separating and returning forces. Here's how EA explains it. When we had the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, when the unmanifested manifested itself in a desire to evolve itself, the first law that came into being 14 billion years ago was the law of polarity. Manifest, unmanifest, separate, return. And when that law came into being, so did separating and returning forces. What religion would call evil and good. I like to use the separating, returning labels because so many of us can have stigmas and fears, Scorpio, just around the term good and evil. So what we can then do as we want to merge with a greater source of power, sometimes it's not the returning forces. Sometimes we will merge with a separating force. Again, separating forces are always going to be intent on tripping us up and returning back to universal source. They're going to be tripping us up in trying to have that separating desire be a substitute for source. And this can be really extorted to extremes in Scorpio, because when this gets distorted, these separating forces and powers will align with them for things like personal gain, or to have power over another person, or to manipulate resources and embezzle money from the nonprofit center that you are the treasurer for. You know, these distortions to merge with separating forces and separating powers can be many and vast, excuse me. I could talk for hours on this. I'm just trying to bring the principle of this into your awareness. So Scorpio, representative of the soul and its dual desire nature, then also helps us beware of those dual desire forces out there in the universe. This is where we become aware of what is larger forces of power than us. And so it sets up then the separating versus returning battle. This is where it gets worked out, is in the archetype of Scorpio. So Jupiter in Scorpio will bring out the best of the best, and it can bring out the worst of the worst. And we can just look at it playing out there on the national scene in the city of Las Vegas, or the city of Edmonton earlier this weekend, as you know, we look at these wounded souls attaching to some force of power with a gun and creating the chaos and violence that has been created on our TV screens. Now, on a more personal level, it is as simple as our desire on an individual soul level to cling to the past for security reasons. I like this house. I like these clothes. I like this lover. I don't want this to change. I just want to have all my comfort and security with my stuff and my things. And yet, just through the natural process of evolution, at some point we're going to be bored or weary, or, you know, want that new desire to replace it of a separating nature. So we become aware of how this past doesn't satisfy us anymore. And this is where we need then that courage to make the necessary changes as the choice points arise in our world. So as we go back and forth between these separating and returning desires, we can have power struggles of an inner nature. I really do want to meditate more. I really do want to follow through on my spiritual practices more. And then we can have outer struggles as well in, you know, letting go of 20 purses in our closet because we only need one or two. The examples are endless here. So you're starting to get this point of emotionally we're going to want to cling to something that represents security for us. It's going to be a greater source of power than what we know with ourselves. And we think that will give us security. And yet sooner or later it raises those deep questions. There must be more than this. This is the stuff of Jupiter and Scorpio. I put this in as I was watching the news this afternoon. I have no idea who this person is. I just looked for a quote on violence. So when you spot violence or bigotry or intolerance or fear or just garden variety misogyny, hatred or ignorance, just look it in the eye and think, the good outnumber you, and we always will. This is that choice point we make with Scorpio. No matter how much we see violence, we can choose love. No matter how much we see hatred, we can choose to be kind. You get the point. Jupiter and Scorpio is choice points. What do we choose to align ourselves with? Separating forces in the universe or returning forces in the universe? Does not mean you're a pacifist. It does not mean that you turn the other cheek in biblical terms. You have the right to Libra before Scorpio, healthy boundaries and fairness. But how do you choose to put emotional energy into moving forward in your world? Jupiter and Scorpio. The Jupiter expansion principle also means recognizing what we can do and what we can't do, what we can manifest and what we can't create. And the most simplest example is if you live in the United States, we can't all grow up and be president. It's just not going to be in the cards for that many people to do it, nor will it mean that our soul is aligned in such a way that we move through that consensus political world to create it. So we all come in with our past. We all come in with our security blanket, that which we know. And within the perimeters of that on a soul level, there are certain things that we can create and things that just aren't there for us to create. And so Scorpio is coming up against those limitations of what you can't create. So it's facing limitations within ourself and making peace with that. I'm 5'1". I'm not going to be as slender as the women who are 5'10". It's just not where my body's going to be unless I want to go into starvation mode. And that's not me. I like food. And what are the limitations that we have with people in our world? We'll talk more on the relationships thing, but because Scorpio is the merging of sexuality and the merging with someone else, it brings up intimacy. And one of the things that we have to learn here is we can't force another person to be in a relationship with us. If we are in some areas of the country or some places in history and we were a master owning slaves, yes, we can force people to do something. Yes, we could be in a situation where our parents decided who we were marry, and we do have those distortions. But as you look at it in your more modern Western perspectives, you can't always force someone to be in a relationship with you. If they want a divorce, they get a divorce in this country. So there's limitations in relationships of what we can do and do without others. How about limitations with resources and money? All of us can recognize that one, most likely. How many of us, no matter what we have in our bank account, would be more than happy to have a few more zeros behind the dollar sign? So we all will have those soul parameters of our relationship with resources, whether it's money or it's the things that money buys. You know, we're not all going to be multimillionaires. And so what this teaches us is those boundaries of power and powerless. And Scorpio then again is going to want to merge with whatever it perceives as a source of power to overcome a limitation. For one person, it may mean going to business college in order to learn how to become the CEO of that big company. For someone else, it's going to be merging with the lover that they perceive to make them happy here and evermore. The power sources can be almost anyone and anything. From a spiritual perspective, merging with Source is the greatest way to overcome whatever we perceive as a limitation, because universal source is the ultimate resource, is where everything ultimately comes from when we recognize that on a spiritual basis. So Jupiter and Scorpio coming up against those boundaries of power and powerless. This is where we have to face those emotions of feeling powerless in whatever way as we've been using. We want to again then merge with that perception of what would be a greater power, be it a separating one or the returning one. And when we do that, what happens with the archetype of Scorpio, when we merge with that, which we perceive we do not have or are not, we osmosis it into us, and we become greater than what we were before the merging. It's that Scorpio word called metamorphosis. And the example is the caterpillar that goes into the, what do they call it, the chrysalis, that then comes out as the butterfly. That is osmosing and becoming something greater than we were before. In natural law, after that merging and osmosis into something more, the next step is to go back into the Taurus polarity of self-reliance. And when we don't do that, it leads to the distortion of codependency. We want to cling to what we perceive as that greater source of power outside of us. And that's where my power source is. If I let go, oh my gosh, I'll lose my power. I'll lose that sense of whatever. And that is false distortions. It is merge, osmosis, separate. Merge, osmosis, separate. This is not what we teach in the distortions of religion or the psychology of intimate relationships typically. I always use the example with clients of the two people getting married and they take their individual candles, they light the third candle, and they blow out their individual candles. No. You take the two candles, you light the third candle, and the two individual candles stay lit. That's how we feed the relationship. So the separating forces in nature, again, will always be attempting to keep us separated. Separating from source, the returning force. Separated from others, because that merging one-on-one with another, the merging with families, the merging with friends, the merging with like-minded souls, the mergings as a culture, the merging of a diversity of cultures. Those are all examples of the merging we do with source. And so separating forces are going to want to keep us clinging to the old desires, repeating the old desires, and keep us separated. Your skin's a different color than my skin. Oh gosh, I can't trust that. I don't like that. You know, your religion's different than my religion. You're wrong. I'm right. All of those things will start to come through. We can see these separating examples come out in extremes through Jupiter and Scorpio. And maybe it has to be such an extreme to get us to change. Do we have to have a massacre of more people than the one we had in Las Vegas before we make changes to gun control laws? Stay tuned. That is an extreme example of a violent separation and keeping us caught up in our emotional fears. And of course, then there are those that will feed upon that rather than making changes and just baby steps into sensible gun reform. I kept getting the intuitive hit today that maybe this might be a turning point in regards to gun laws in this country. Didn't matter if every person, 22,000 festival goers at the concert, all 22,000 could have had a gun, and it would have done them no good because of the extreme of violent guns that were used. So sometimes those Jupiter and Scorpio extremes of example emotionally shock us well enough to say, no, I think we got to figure out a different way to do this. Another archetype is trust issues. And when we don't have inner trust, this is when all of the distorted Scorpio words like obsessive compulsive disorder, possessiveness, wanting to be real protective, you know, the control issues, the power issues, any of the distorted Scorpio words you can think of, it really comes from, I don't feel safe in my world, therefore I have to control it. And what this leads us to is that polarity, Taurus. Excuse me a minute. Hey, I remembered my mute button in time, but my throat might be a little raw and I may have to go through just doing a little cough drop, everybody. Thank you very much for allowing that. But the whole issue of trust is feeling safe within ourselves and safe in our world. And we have to feel safe in their inner world in order to be safe in the outer world. Because of these big dual forces in the universe, we can't control it out there enough to change it. It has to start in here. And then when enough people start banding together in inner self-reliance and a trusting of their inner self, they'll find themselves in the right place at the right time, being safe, and more people coming together feeling safe. We all know this. You can't bomb your way to peace. We must energize ourselves to peace. And we must work with those who have the extremes of the emotional wounds that get exposed in an archetype like Scorpio. We have to teach self-reliance. We have to teach people being able to provide food, clothing, shelter, the basics for survival of Taurus, that polarity to Scorpio. That's what then builds up trust inwardly and builds up a universe in which you can trust the stranger next to you. Big, broad concepts, and yet very germane to the discussion right now and over this next year. In other words, we will continue to evolve through relationships with Jupiter and Scorpio. Relationships comes from the word relativity, and that is relating inwardly to myself, the inner Venus Taurus, and outwardly to others, the outer Venus Libra. That leads us into then committed relationships, the marriage type relationships, Scorpio. But it goes way beyond even just intimacy one-on-one. It's being able to feel intimacy with a like-minded group of people. I mean, just think for a moment, even though we are connecting over the internet in a webinar, looking at a screen, we recognize that from a cosmological or spiritual perspective, many of us may be on similar enough page, if not identical, similar enough that we can feel a compatibility with each other, we can feel a bonding with each other, and groups of people can go through metamorphosis just as much as individuals. Now, Jupiter in Scorpio brings all kinds of things to a head. On an intimacy basis and on a collective basis, it brings the endings, it brings the beginnings, it brings an evolution of relating patterns and desires. And first of all, we're going to be made aware of any old relating patterns that have crystallized, or any old patterns we're clinging to for security reasons. I've long known that this person was no longer best as my partner, but we've been married for 55 years. We have kids, we got grandkids. I'm just going to stick with it. I just don't have the energy to go through a divorce and live on my own. How many of us grew up with those types of parents? And what typically happens is sooner or later, there is that Scorpio death, and one is left alone. Look at how our religions teach us through the marriage ceremony, till death us do part. Is that a Scorpio codependency or limitation or control factor via religion or one partner over the other? And so that inability to move that fixed water of Scorpio, Jupiter's going to push it. Jupiter's going to create some fire and steam. It's going to bring it to the surface, and we have to somehow find the way to move forward through the confrontation. When there is that Taurus polarity of self-reliance, self-acceptance, self-love, self-empowerment, then we can sometimes be the ones that create a Scorpio confrontation when something needs to come to a head and change. Fixed water has a tendency to wish for stability until it builds up in pressure and there's some type of Plutonian explosion and the landscape changes one way or another. Excuse me. Okay, come on. Okay, there. So yes, Jupiter in Scorpio will bring relationship commitments, the marriage type commitments. And when I say this, I don't necessarily limit it to be a male, a female. I teach much broader, whether it's same gender, whether three people decide to come together in a committed relationship. Welcome to the Aquarian age. There will be the building of energy to make the commitment, and there will be the building of energy to bring about an ending as well. Neither one is fated. It's always going to depend upon the individual natures of whomever parties are involved. One of the things that can have a tendency to happen with Scorpio energy and Jupiter in Scorpio is we can create the attraction outside of the committed relationship. The famous love affairs or sex affairs. And there can be the exposure of that and the feelings of emotional betrayals from that. We've become overly identified with another person for security reasons. And when we have the exposure of an affair and we are the ones who have been betrayed, then it throws us back into that Taurian self, and we have to deepen our self-reliance, and we have to address whatever's come up in the midst of that relationship. And do we move through it? Do we heal it? Or do we take the Y in the road? Because Scorpio will also signify what we can call those natural endings. You know, the most natural way, of course, is death. More on that in a moment. But if we're in any type of committed relationship and we've become too dependent upon that other person for our sense of self, evolution can remove it. Jupiter can take it away. And in the same respect, there can be that distortion of Taurus polarity, isolation. If I don't risk, I don't get hurt. Well, self-trust and self-reliance allows us to be able to commit to that risk. That's that Scorpio courage. I'm going to go forth and try my best in this relationship. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to take what I learned and go on to this or something better. So we're always looking through these relationships and relativity and mergings of Scorpio. We're always looking for ways to deepen our inner self-reliance so that we can find the courage to move forward in whatever ways are necessary in our world. And of course, one of the things that can happen with Jupiter and Scorpio is the whole possibility of soulmates. And from evolutionary astrology's perspective, these are two people who come together for the purpose of their own individual spiritual growth and evolution. There'll still be karma, there'll still be upsets, there'll still be lessons and experiences to learn, but there will be a spiritual foundation upon which they will be addressed. In other words, we shift from the karma mate, I will love you if, to the soulmate, I will love you no matter what, even if you choose the Y in the road. So look for that deepening of your own soul growth. And then you will start to magnetize to you. Magnetism is a Taurus Scorpio word. You will magnetize to you others who are also working on their own spiritual evolutions. And of course, I didn't put a lot in on this. We can talk about it a little bit, but I've been touching upon it. Jupiter in Scorpio is, of course, going to bring up all kinds of sexuality issues and lessons. You can expect to see multiple sexual scandals in the news. Somebody cheated on somebody, somebody abused somebody, something happens in some way. And for those of you, I did not know, I had heard the word, but I didn't know what it meant until last year's US presidential election race. I didn't know what the word misogyny was. It's abuse of women, especially on sexual ways or demeaning them in some way. So we can expect those types of things to be in the news and cycle back around again. And of course, if it comes up in your own personal world and your own intimate relationships, it will throw us back into that Taurian polarity in which self-sexuality is a natural part of self-reliance. In other words, self-sexuality is a nice way of saying masturbation. It exists as part of natural sexuality, being able to take care of our own sexual needs, as well as merging with another. And even when we're in an intimate relationship, it doesn't mean that satisfying yourself sexually should be suppressed or repressed. Both should exist in a healthy sexual relationship with somebody outside of yourself. We can also see perhaps those sexuality issues of, you know, they've been in our news history where someone captures someone else and makes them the sex slave and they're able to break free. Human sex trafficking, all of those distortions of the words, we can easily see that stuff in the news. It's always been there because our sexuality is so distorted in human consciousness, almost no matter where you live on planet Earth. Maybe Jupiter and Scorpio will bring up some deep psychological discussions of the fact that sexuality is a natural part of our world that we need to work with. In general, remember, Scorpio, Jupiter in Scorpio is going to bring up all kinds of emotional frustrations as any of our security buttons get pushed. And Jupiter in Scorpio is going to bring that potential then to identify the essence, the psychology of whatever those issues or areas of life that are emotionally triggered, whatever those areas are that we need to focus on, so that Scorpio, we can penetrate, Jupiter, discover and solve whatever the mystery of our life may be, in whatever way, to evolve ourselves and to evolve others in general and the relationships that we are in with others. Jupiter in Scorpio, I don't know if I put the word psychology in here. I think it shows up, just naturally in sentences, but you want to, Scorpio is called the eagle eye. You put Jupiter in Scorpio and there is such a strong eagle eye to just get to the bottom line of any issue and what needs to be addressed or changed in order to evolve. Jupiter. You natal Jupiter in Scorpios, every time you have a Jupiter in Scorpio return, it is an expansion of your own spiritual, psychological intuition on deep ways. And all you do is you look to see what house that natal Jupiter in Scorpio is in. That's where you're going to focus that energy. Transiting Jupiter in Scorpio is going to be in the same place. That's going to be an area where you really came to dig deep and understand broad in this lifetime. Those of us who have transiting Jupiter and Scorpio through a certain house, we're going to be doing it through that transiting house. Dig deep. Try to understand it in the broadest terms possible so that we have a sense of connection to the universe, a sense of being able to trust ourselves. So, Scorpio is the archetype of death and rebirth, both literal and figurative. And in Scorpio, death can be the ultimate lesson of leaving the separating desires behind and reaching for the next level of self-reliance, which is merging with Source. You know that old phrase, you can't take it with you. You're born naked and you die naked. You cannot take all your stuff with you. And so this might be some of what we experience in various ways with Jupiter and Scorpio. Again, it's literal and figurative. So just ponder around you. What are the figurative deaths going on in your world? What are you being asked to recognize no longer serves your soul? It's a separating desire to release. Nature hates a void, something to fill it back up. Okay? And we have to make that conscious effort to fill it up with Source. Again, my Piscean words, what would you have me know, Source? What would you have me do, Source? So reincarnation is a Scorpio word. And it, basically is the progressive elimination of all barriers or separating desires, preventing a direct merging with the ultimate source of power. Universal source, evolving force, God, Goddess itself, however you perceive it. So Here's an example of this that was in the news today. And I just chose to use the same transit time as our Las Vegas event. I probably should have put in California where he was at the time. But in case some of you are social media dinosaurs, Tom Petty died today. Tom Petty is Leroy's, I guess, favorite band. I mean, if you ask Leroy his favorite band, he has consistently said Tom Petty for years. And we were actually blessed enough to see him in concert a decade ago with Joe Walsh and Stevie Nicks. Look at this chart. There is no known time for Tom Petty. So many astrologers use 12 noon and put the sun at the top of the chart because that's where it is at 12 noon. I like to use 0-degree houses. When I don't know the house, I'm just going to stay with the signs in their natural houses. But look at everything that was going on. I mean, the one that sticks out the most is here's Jupiter at 28 degrees Libra, and his sun is 27 degrees Libra. This is the ultimate configuration of Jupiter, even in Libra. Remember, Jupiter in general can create the space that we expand into. So here's an ultimate death. When I drew up the chart, and I saw the moon. He collapsed last night, yesterday evening, and he was found unresponsive. He wasn't gone, but they took him off life support, and I think he passed today. But when I saw the transiting moon at 25 degrees Aquarius and at 12 noon, October 20th, 1950, birth time of 28 degrees Aquarius, I went, oh my gosh, I wonder if he may have been born before 12 noon. And again, this is where the moon was last night at 10 o'clock Pacific time. I wonder if he was born before and his moon was even closer to the transiting moon. This is also opposite that 29-degree Leo solar eclipse. So many times there are astrologers who feel that death can be triggered by planets reaching eclipse points or aspects to eclipse points after an eclipse, whether solar or lunar. You can just see how many of these different conjunctions were in orbs of conjunctions in his chart. But I found this Jupiter Sun one quite specific. And then, of course, the South Node and the transiting moon conjunctions to Jupiter, which we know to be at about 27.5 Aquarius. And this birth moon a little unknown here. Rest in peace, Tom. No more Tom Petty new music. We're going to have to work through all those classics. He had just finished touring, and he was known to have publicly said that this was going to be his last tour. He was well known for spending his entire life doing nothing but make music and tour, make music and tour. What was that other band, Traveling Wilburys, that he established for a while with a couple of other major musicians? So even though Jupiter is late Libra, I thought this was a good example of the Jupiter space being opened up and Jupiter getting ready to initiate into Scorpio. Finally, Jupiter in Scorpio is going to be dealing with resources in all kinds of ways. Taurus is self-resources, seeing ourself as a resource. Scorpio is merging resources with others to create more than what we could create on our own. However, sometimes Jupiter in Scorpio can be, again, recognizing how much excess do I need? And can we simplify our life the Taurus polarity, and make things more basic, the Taurus polarity. It can be quite, excuse my burp, that can be quite strong when Jupiter moves through Scorpio. And of course, as you know, when this gets distorted, there can be all kinds of manipulations of other people's resources for self-gain most of the time. Again, somebody embezzling old people and stealing their money. The spouse who hides all of the assets before filing for divorce. The examples can be all over the place. You know, you can just look around you and probably see it a gazillion different ways. The Jupiter in Scorpio will bring resources, and I include money as a resource. I find if I just say money or finances, it's a more limited archetype than saying resources, because resources can be more than non-physical. Resources can be land, it can be assets, it can be investments, it can be more than what you make with your income. Use this word on a broad level. All that stuff comes up for review through Jupiter in Scorpio. On an individual basis, we would all want to be prioritizing what resources are important to us, and perhaps being careful not to live beyond our means. That expansionary principle of Jupiter in Scorpio can have us maxing out the credit card or living beyond our means to keep up with the neighborhood Joneses. There can be distortions that way as well, in which we're merging with that outer source of power resource way beyond what's going to allow us to have some healthy growth. These examples you'll see all over the place, but on your own personal level, again, you're going to want to take stock of your resources and any resources that you share with others and prioritize. Am I living beyond my means? I'll show you more on the specific financial stuff here in a little bit with some aspects. Jupiter, you know, what have the Republicans been speaking all the way through the election race last year and all the way through this year? They want to overhaul the tax code, which is ridiculously big, and it does need to be overhauled. But they're going for tax cuts rather than tax reform, and they're going for corporate and upper class gains, even though they say different words. Jupiter can be that Pied Piper. Listen to what I say, believe what I say, not what I do. And this is exactly what will try to come down. And I think Jupiter in Scorpio is going to require the masses of citizens in the United States standing up for this reform that doesn't make things worse yet financially. The example is we have Republicans who portray entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security as the reason for the federal debt. Never do they talk about the fact that if you get a paycheck, if you get a W-2, Social Security is taken out, Medicaid is taken out. Your Social Security pays and goes towards Medicare. And so does it need to be reformed? Probably. Let's get rid of the upper limits on what can be taxed for Social Security. Probably everybody on this call who receives a W-2 has 100% of that taxed, whereas I think if you get, I don't know what the upper limit is where they stop taking out Social Security now, but those who make big $6, $7 incomes, as income, they don't have all of it taxed. Here's the real thing. Our military budget is greater than the next 7 largest countries' military budgets combined. This is what creates the federal debt. This is where we live beyond our means. And of course, that military industrial complex, America has to be the greatest. It has to be the most powerful. Those are Scorpio words, that power versus powerless. This can all come up for review through Jupiter and Scorpio, especially if we have any economic downturns. And so, of course, again, they're just trying to pass the tax cuts for wealthy at the expense of middle and lower class. I expect this to be debated quite a bit through Jupiter and Scorpio, and especially if we can get more of the Democratic Party willing to stand up for fairness for all, which I don't know. Stay tuned. We'll see. There can be all kinds of collective financial resources, laws or Jupiter, policies that will come to choice points, that fixed modality, building up pressure till something gives. Typical with Jupiter and Scorpio, we could see an increase in bankruptcies, both on an individual level and on a massive or large collective level that, it's just like, jiminies, how could they go bankrupt? Big, multinational corporation. We may see bankruptcy laws overhauled. They were overhauled back in the Pluto and Sagittarius days, and I'm not going to remember the details specific, but they were overhauled to such a point that individual bankruptcy in the U.S. for the poor and middle class did not erase all your debt, and it did not touch your student college debt. You can file a bankruptcy, and you will come through it as a 30-year-old, and you'll have every penny of student debt before you filed bankruptcy. So maybe there might be something where this gets overhauled for the good. We can see financial institutions trying underhanded ways at making money at the expense of the masses. In other words, following the financial downturn in 2008, we really didn't correct the laws or put in the necessary safeguards. It looked like it. We made some steps, but what happened in 2008 could easily happen again. So these financial things like credit default swaps or derivatives or stock market evaluations swinging up and down, this can come around again. I forgot a positive one to put in here. What's called the Tobin Tax by some English gentleman whose last name was Tobin, who brought forth the idea that all investments must have a 1% tax, all investment transactions, because so many of the hedge fund managers and upper elites, they are trading on the stock market in back and forth in outrageous numbers of trades and making money with fractions on the penny. And those extremes would be tamed down if we had a tax on investments. Just a 1% tax on investments in the United States would probably take care of so much of our federal debt, and then we really could have tax cuts for the middle and lower class, because we'd have another source of income, and it's all speculation income. It's not anybody necessarily gambling with their W-2 form. Tobin Tax, let's see if that comes up in the news over the next year. We can have all kinds of countries all over the world arguing over debt and the use of debt in healthy ways, the abuse of debt. And when a government is sovereign and it creates its own money, it doesn't have to have debt. But I mean, sometimes these issues are hard to wrap your mind around. We gave away our ability to make our own money to the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. And so this whole issue of public versus private central banking could come up again with Jupiter and Scorpio, as well as Uranus and Taurus. More on that. And, you know, of course, they're just going to try to come up with all kinds of ways that we can't afford entitlements for the citizens, and not just in the U.S. The European countries can do it in all kinds of ways. You know, they did it in Puerto Rico, and I don't remember the details on how they got in debt, but I think it involves some of these credit default swaps, and all of a sudden they ended up with these massive debts that nobody could ever afford. And of course, this is used as a way of saying, well, we can't afford health care in the U.S. Well, guess what? The United States per capita health care is 3 times the average of the rest of the industrialized world. And if we can bring down costs of pharmaceuticals and the insurance by spreading it out among all of us, we can save money. Universal health care is quite affordable. I saw the greatest quote shortly. It's like, why is it that every other industrialized country in the world that created universal health care has never had a vote to take it away and go back to the capitalistic market like the US? They don't even hear about that stuff. And of course, we might have some inflation or deflation of all kinds of different asset classes that could come about, varying by country and their charts, and who knows? We'll see it in all kinds of different ways. Okay, I may not have given a thorough thing of the archetypes, but hopefully this will give you some deep psychology of how Jupiter and Scorpio is going to work in the various ways that you can see it coming out for yourself personally, and of course on a collective level as well. I'd like to just go through Jupiter's aspects now as it moves through Scorpio for the next year. It just so happens that its annual cycle with the sun, conjunction to conjunction, is always taking place in the early degrees of whatever sign Jupiter just transited into or ingressed into. It's not always that way. It could happen in the middle of it. It's just the way it happens to be going right now in the current decade. The fixed modality, I just have a tendency sometimes to put up a few of the hard aspects. So I've got the squares and of course the Jupiter retrograde opposition. That fixed modality, it's going to test who has the power. Remember, Jupiter and Scorpio, power versus powerless, individually, collectively. Every time we have these aspects, it's going to throw us back into self-reliance, self-empowerment, self-sustainment. These aspects could bring us resource upsets wherever necessary. The intent would be to redistribute. That may or may not sometimes happen. That is not what happened when Pluto went into Sag. Of course, distortions here with this fixed modality. Again, fixed water, fixed air, fixed earth, fixed fire with the hard aspects here. Power grabs, manipulations, all kinds of financial stuff taking place. And of course, more shootings and death. Scorpio can be violence. That's why I looked up that violence quote. We could see even more intensity of it with Jupiter in Scorpio, and I hope I am so wrong. Here's Jupiter's retrograde. March 9th, 2018 at 23:13 Scorpio. Goes direct July 10th, 2018 at 13:21 Scorpio. With the opposition to the Sun, May 9th, 2018, 18:21 Taurus, Scorpio. Jupiter retrograde. This is where we're going to review everything we've talked about so far. Reviewing our codependencies, our manipulations, our obsession compulsions, our control games to power over, power under, reviewing our commitments, reviewing whatever resources we share with others. All the Scorpio Jupiter words we've talked about are going to be reviewed. And of course, the Scorpio polarity is Taurus. So the lesson is again throwing us in on ourselves to create self-reliance on every level. Taurian self-reliance is physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, all 4 levels. And of course, when we evolve into deeper, broader self-reliance, it brings about encouraging empowerment of others. Self-reliant people don't do power over others. Self-reliant people do not let themselves become powerless to others. They encourage healthy empowerment of everyone, that win-win. And of course, after any Scorpio merging to osmosis into a new form, as we talked before, comes the return back to a new self, that Taurus polarity. So this is an annual transit of really evolving into a new and better version of ourself in relationship to all the resources on planet Earth. And of course, that Taurus polarity is simplification of the resources, simplification of what we need to fulfill ourselves as we exhaust those outer separating desires and fill ourselves up with the inner returning desire to know source. We are satisfied with less. We are satisfied with experience over stuff. And if we've become too codependent upon anything, of course, the Jupiter retrograde will throw us back into the Taurian polarity of our self in some way. Here is the opposition that comes along in May with Jupiter's retrograde to the Sun. All day leading up to that opposition on May 8th or May 9th. I can't remember what I think my other one might have said the next day. The moon is, the transiting moon, late Aquarius, is in a T-square here as these two are in opposition. What I thought was interesting about the Jupiter opposition to Sun chart is look at how Mars and Mercury activate the Uranus-Pluto first quarter squares. Mercury tight square to Pluto. Mars tight square to Uranus. This to me, it just brings forth that whole issue of who has the power and control. And so all these issues that we've been speaking about up to this point, are they going to collapse into the haves and have-nots, those who have power taking it away from the powerlessness? Or will it bust into some type of metamorphic evolution that the masses say, no, you must pass tax reform that works for all of us. No, we want universal health care and we're going to figure out how to do it, even if it means building less bombs. Stay tuned. We will see how all of this unfolds. I put in the major aspects of Jupiter retrograde in Scorpio. We'll look at a few of these on an individual basis, but it almost always has an opposition to Venus in addition to the Sun, and almost always has an opposition to Mercury. Just having this for reference for you. Moving on, the Nodal Axis has one major aspect to Jupiter in Scorpio, and that is the fact that right around Christmas time, the nodes of the moon are going to create squares to Jupiter in Scorpio. The nodes will be within orb of the square from mid-November through the end of February. And because it's the nodes of the moon, and Scorpio's a water sign, I think through the end of the year, early next year, this winter, oh, what do they call that? Where you're just so tired, cabin fever. Be careful of pressure building up in your colder, in the northern hemisphere where it's going to be cold, because the pressure will build up to confront limitations in some way. And of course, the lesson is going to be integrating whatever is showing up to learn. We want to reach for deep psychological questioning and questing on our spiritual issues. We want to look for the courage to have self-honesty, Jupiter, self-love, North Node in Leo, objectivity, South Node in Aquarius, because otherwise we go to the distortions of blaming everyone else for the issues going on. And we go into the drama, trauma situations and just exaggerate them all over the place for control, manipulation, emotional codependencies, playing the victim, all that stuff. Objectivity, complete and utter self-honesty throughout this winter. Mercury. Here it is from conjunction October 17 to Scorpio to the next one, December 21st, 18 into Sag. There will be 2 Mercury retrograde cycles where there are 3 conjunctions to Jupiter, a last quarter square, and the conjunction at the end, which mixes in Scorpio Sag. I do free Mercury retrograde webinars, so I'm not going to go into this. Stay tuned for the webinars as we move along next year for this being more relevant in detail. I will say Mercury is left brain, logical, detailed, analytical mind. Jupiter, as we know, is right brain, intuitive, abstract mind. Jupiter and Mercury is always a progressive surrender to deeper psychologies and beliefs. And when we are not open to that, we get quite stubborn. I'm right, you're wrong. Venus goes from conjunction to conjunction. Venus will have 2 aspects to Jupiter while Jupiter's retrograde. Venus-Jupiter will take relationships to the extreme in both good and bad ways. Again, you want to watch for the Scorpio words, stubbornness, jealousy, obsession. You really want to be able to listen to another person and understand where they're coming from, their values, and you want the same to come back for you. And of course, Venus ruling Taurus, resource issues will come along with these 2, and they can be both good or bad. Again, as we talked, financial patterns coming to a head. Natural law, giving, sharing, including. Patriarchal distortions, taking, hoarding, excluding. These could be emphasized with the Venus-Jupiter aspects, and I just wanted to briefly say, next year, there's a Jupiter retrograde cycle, October to November, 11 Scorpio to 25 Libra. So the tail end of that Venus retrograde cycle, 3 waning semi-sextiles to Jupiter. So Venus gets almost through a cycle with Jupiter before it's retrograde, and that waning semi-sextile, 330 degrees, what do we value the most? It really wants us returning to source, returning back to our most deepest levels of inner security and self-reliance. It's balsamic phase semi-sextiles. So it's going to emphasize a review of relating values and relationships. Venus retrograde in Scorpio, Jupiter in Scorpio. It can bring resource rewards or upsets to be resolved because they're waning semi-sextiles. whatever we've been doing since Jupiter's conjunction mid-October 2017, whatever we put into our resource efforts will come home to roost right here, whether it is a fruition and reward or it's an upset and resolution. Mars has a retrograde cycle next year as well. Here's the two aspects Mars makes during the Jupiter retrograde, and then Mars goes retrograde just before Jupiter goes direct in early July, okay? There really isn't any Mars aspects to Jupiter while it is, no, there'll be a waxing in conjunct. I guess I did forget that one. But Mars is you know, Mars is a 2-year cycle to any of the outer planets, okay? So Mars is going to go from conjunction to first quarter square, 90 degrees in those 10 months while it slows down for a retrograde cycle from 9 Aquarius to 28 Capricorn. So Mars is expanding that first quadrant of the circle. It's expanding, it's wanting to create, it's wanting to achieve desires. And then as it goes through that review at the end of Jupiter and Scorpio, it wants to bust through any of those Jupiter and Scorpio limitations. Pluto represents the unconscious desire nature, Pluto ruling Scorpio, 8th house. Mars represents conscious desires ruling Aries, 1st house. Soul makes unconscious desires conscious through Mars. And so this combination of these two, especially as we get into the middle of next year, we're going to want to be merging. We're going to be wanting to achieve something. And even if it is achieving a new separating desire, again, no judgment, we're going to have to figure out where we're feeling frustrated with limitations, what we need to merge with to create more. It'll involve resources, intimacy, and it can bring career into the picture with Mercury retrograding back in to the tail end of Capricorn. With it retrograding in Aquarius, it can be quite helpful to detach as much as possible to any Jupiter and Scorpio emotions that get stirred up. Otherwise, we're going to do those distortions of fear and get very protective and controlling. You know, Mars can get quite manipulating as it moves through Capricorn, etc. Jupiter and the outer planets. I thought I would review this one for you. Jupiter is going to conjunct all 5 outer planets. I include Chiron in here. You know, Pluto's not supposed to be a planet. Chiron is a dwarf planet, I think. Well, they're all archetypes if you're studying astrology. But Jupiter will conjunct these 5 outer planets in just 4 years, 2020 through 24. That's going to come in the midst of transiting Pluto conjunct the U.S. natal Pluto in 2022. Just looking at that, can you see how heightened things are going to be through the end of this decade, moving into the beginning of the next one? Here are the conjunctions. 3 to Pluto, then Saturn, all in 2020. Then Neptune 22, Chiron 23, Uranus 2024. So, whew, I mean, just look at how much that is going to have Jupiter busting things out. Jupiter and Scorpio, where are you intuiting what is down the road and coming on the horizon? Here's the other thing to consider with Jupiter building up to these conjunctions. Since Jupiter had its last opposition to Uranus, Jupiter is now in the second half of the circle to the 5 outer planets. In other words, Jupiter is waning to Saturn, Pluto, Neptune, Chiron, and Uranus. So it's going to catch up, conjunct this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, as we saw previous screen. But what we want to recognize from it is the ability of Jupiter to have growth and expansion is from here on out limited, second half, to what the outer planets will each accept. You got that? Jupiter in the first half of the cycle to an outer planet thinks it's in charge, moving us ahead, evolving, expanding, growing here, and it reaches an opposition, and then it has to start to surrender back to the slower moving planet. So Jupiter then will start to emphasize that letting go, that release, that loss, that creating the void that can no longer be sustained as it is waning to these 5 outer planets. Just a broad concept that is quite helpful to recognize in regards to Jupiter. And if you think about this, as Jupiter moves through Scorpio, it's going to just literally, naturally be frustrated because it's got to listen to the outer planets. Doesn't get to be in charge anymore. So during this Jupiter and Scorpio transit, it's going to make 3 aspects with its retrograde to Saturn, Chiron, Neptune, Pluto. We'll go through each of these aspects here quite hopefully quickly, getting through these next screens for you. Jupiter with Saturn. It is a 20-year cycle. I've put conjunction to conjunction here for you. This year, Jupiter is going to make 3 waning semi-squares to Saturn. This is going from last quarter phase to balsamic phase. And did I put disseminating in there? No, that should be semi-square. Okay, hold on. I gotta correct a mistake. I gotta make a note here. Sorry about that, but I've got to correct that for you. The disseminatings are to Chiron. So this is the semi-square from, again, last quarter phase to balsamic phase. Balsamic phase is where we're returning back to source. So here's Jupiter winding down a 20-year cycle to have 1 conjunction at 0 Aquarius. This is going to be a bust-out conjunction. But here it is in Scorpio to Capricorn, but it's not the nice sextile. It's the 45. It's the 315 mark that goes, oh, I don't get to manifest this anymore. I don't get to bring this through anymore. And so this is still true here. What benefits all people concerned? Balsamic phase. Social issues progress from collective evolution of understanding. When Jupiter gets waning down closer to Saturn, it really asks us to look at larger and larger social perspectives. Yes, Leroy?
Oh, I'm sorry. I clicked myself off.
You clicked yourself open.
I'm sorry, yes, but I just wanted to congratulate you on all the information.
Oops, I didn't know I was live. So again, when we get to that balsamic phase, we've got to be looking at the broadest collective cycle we can possibly look at as we return to the ultimate value of source with balsamic phase again. And so anything that needs to be resolved with Jupiter Saturn on that collective level, the stuff that doesn't work anymore is going to fall apart. Seed thoughts of what's coming from the next conjunction could be sown. The distortion of this is where one group or groups will be attempting to have power over another group or groups of people. So there's a real struggle here over who's going to control the social issues the financial issues, the gun control issues, the healthcare issues. Jupiter in Scorpio, who's going to have the power with Saturn as it's moving into Capricorn? And keep in mind that both of these two are balsamic to Pluto in Capricorn. Breaking down of social structures that are really not working, and people either feeling totally victimized by Thalmic phase, hopeless, or just really coming together on broader and broader collective groups, especially the closer that Jupiter gets to, again, this Saturn conjunction at 0 degrees Aquarius. The Jupiter Chiron cycle varies in the number of years that it takes place because Chiron has such an elliptic cycle itself, and it's 51 years. Here's the conjunctions of 09 in Aquarius. Anybody remember those? We really thought quantum physics healing modalities would just explode out there. We really learned attention, energy flows where attention goes. Here's one of those next conjunctions in Aries the next time. Jupiter Chiron is the evolution of our intuitive healing abilities. And this Chiron's discovery, I think it was 1978, 77 or 78, it just exploded all the self-healing, metaphysical modalities onto planet Earth. So that's their cycle together. They will have the waning sesquiquadrates, the waning squares and a half from a full phase to disseminating phase. Here's where the disseminating phase is coming through. First of all, we're going to be searching for a deep emotional self-honesty in healing any old wounds. Jupiter in Scorpio is going to allow us to really psychologically pierce those Chiron in Pisces victimization stories. And in the midst of this, it's quite possible, disseminating phase. I say new healing modalities. For those of us, it's not really the word new. It's newly accepted onto the social plate more and more and more. These might be the aspects that create the squeeze to progress in the U.S. universal health care, single payer system more and more and more on a collective level. In other words, disseminating phase is collective choices, collective information, what works for the group. So we could see the birthing of new ground. And where would this subject be more in germane than guns versus butter, as they called it in World War II, which is money for the military versus money for what's good for the masses, be it health care or literal gun control. Distorting, we could remain stuck in a powerless Chiron in Pisces victimization mode. Jupiter in Scorpio, going for the power over, giving our power away to others, power elites trying to take it away. Really is going to work with Jupiter sticking with the collective to see anything come through in moving us socially progressively forward. Jupiter-Uranus is a 14-year cycle. Here were their conjunctions, 2010-11. Aries Pisces, here's their next one, 2024 in Taurus. So as a planetary pair, this is the conscious evolution, Jupiter, of the individualization, Uranus, process, Jupiter. Pisces, the interconnectedness of all species, an awareness of that. Aries, that freedom to believe and do whatever I want, and the interchange between those two as those three conjunctions took place in those two signs. So we're looking at expanding the awareness of social collective groups as well. The evolution of collective social rights. Jupiter, Uranus. The expansion of our belief systems based upon the changing world we live in, or making sense of technology. Their aspects over the next year, only one. Again, we're coming off of the Jupiter-Uranus oppositions in Libra Aries, remember? So now Jupiter moves through 30 degrees beyond the opposition, the waning in conjunct. So there's a recognizing limits of social groups and efforts, which means there's a need to compromise. How do we evolve gun control? How do we evolve raising money in political races? How do we evolve social care for all? There can be a recognizing from these limits. There can also be a recognizing of various groups banding together, stronger, united together. So those who'd like a better living wage could merge with those who are wanting better gun control or health care, and could merge with recognizing that, you know, all lives matter and we need racial justice no matter what group you're with. There can be this merging of all kinds of various social groups here. There's only one in conjunct. So there's other factors that I think are bringing all this together. One being Jupiter's waning second half to all the outer planets. Of course, distortion is again one group attempting to have power over others and thwart or reverse social progress. Stay tuned, we'll see. But the other thing that happens next year is Uranus goes into Taurus. Uranus leaves Aries, goes into Taurus in May, retrogrades back into Aries, and then goes into Taurus for the next 7 years in early 2019. Just the fact of Uranus ingressing into Taurus will trigger Jupiter in Scorpio just by the signs, even though they're beyond opposition. It's going to bring up inner versus outer security issues. I am expecting some major resource and financial upsets next year when Uranus goes into Taurus. By the way, over the course of the winter, after the first of the year, I will do a longer term series of Uranus in Taurus through all of the 12 houses. Stay tuned as I put that together, and we'll announce it plenty of time. But with Jupiter and Scorpio shared resources and Uranus going into Taurus survival resources, I expect financial upsets to come along from this. It also can easily bring relationship crises due to changing relating dynamics. The number one issue creating divorce is monetary. The number two issue around divorce is communication. So when money upsets come along, it can really trigger the security and longevity of relationships. So again, because we've not protected our banking laws and policies, there could be another financial downturn, scarcity fears or abuse of laws and policies in regards to any of that stuff. Stay tuned, okay? Quickly, oops, here I go again. Quickly, I did an on our website educational webinars is my public banking solution webinar, which I highly recommend because I'm an advocate of public banking. A government that owns its own bank can keep the interest and invest it locally, resulting in potential savings of 35 to 40%. That's the interest, okay? Banking and credit become public utilities, sustaining the economy rather than mining it for public gain. And banks again become safe places to store our monies, both for our public revenues and our private savings. This issue is going to cycle around again, folks, with Uranus in Taurus. It's the extremes of inequality between the financial haves and the 99% of have-nots is ridiculous. It's even more extreme than it was in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Something will come along to redistribute it. Will it be a trigger, an upset, or will it be the grassroots changes? Public versus private central banking. Central banks may or may not be independent of government. Here are their functions: conduct monetary policy, stability of the financial system, issue the currencies, act as banker, supervise financial institutions, regulate payment systems. So when profits are generated from private bank credit, it ends up to CEOs and shareholders, private coffers. When profits are generated from public bank credit, the profits are returned to the public. You, me, taxpayers and citizens, taking care of our youth, our elderly, building up our infrastructure. Oh, and by the way, universal health care. I've spent a lot of time really looking at this issue, and we have been sold such a bill of goods. It behooves each and every one of you who would like to have natural prosperity to study this issue through Jupiter and Scorpio. I'll try to stop preaching other than one more slide. Join and support the Public Banking Institute. It works mainly for the US, but all kinds of ideas that can be replicated anywhere around the world. You can get active on a city count or statewide level. They have just put up the money in Oakland to create the feasibility of studying a public bank. They're looking at creating a green bank to park all the legal marijuana, money from legalizing marijuana. This is going to explode during Uranus and Taurus, especially if we have another financial upset. There are too many public officials that are starting to get this public versus private central banking. If you got some cash and assets, you're only guaranteed in the US up to $250K. So put it in a credit union or a community bank. Yes, it's okay to put it in metals. Again, we keep being sold a bill of goods on inflation, and we have had such a decrease in the amount of money going around that I won't even get into it, but I just don't think we're going to see any inflation. We have plenty of goods and services, but we don't have people with enough money to buy it. Educate yourself. Again, change from the grassroots up, which is Cancer, the Pluto and Cat polarity. And of course, as Uranus leaves Aries and goes into Taurus, the Scorpio polarity to Uranus and Taurus says, wait a minute. Can we pool our resources together and create something for the good of all of us? So these two could easily bring some financial reckonings next year. And again, it's the opportunity to take back public control of monetary policies and the giving, sharing, and including. The Jupiter-Neptune cycle is 13 years. You can see the conjunctions on your screen there from back in 2009 in Aquarius. The next one, 2022, one of them will be in Pisces. This is the evolution of our beliefs on the broadest levels with a personal implementation. Because Jupiter's conscious beliefs, Neptune is the deepest level of unconscious beliefs. And so this, again, with their last conjunction cycle, is a leap into quantum physics. More and more of us recognizing that universal source isn't the old man on a white beard sitting up on a cloud. It is an evolving force of energy. Jupiter will make 3 waning trines to Neptune throughout its cycle through Scorpio. This will bring potential for deep spiritual reflections on emotional levels to water signs. And Jeffrey Wolf Green's teachings always said evolution, Jupiter, takes place through the emotional body. And so can we really recognize Neptune and Pisces, that spirit and flesh are 2 sides of the same coin? Here again is that possibility where we might see some sacred sexuality come through. If not, the distortions, we'll see the human sexual trafficking, we'll see, sexual scandals that can come through because waning trines can get by with things. We can see manipulation games based upon emotional fears and weaknesses. This would be that misogyny, racial tension, and homophobia. And of course, financial elites trying to spin, just trust us, we'll take care of everything, and you'll be safe, and you'll be all warm and fuzzy while they rob us blind. And I thought I'd put this one in here. Just sending out a big hug to whoever may need one right now. And at the end of the day, tell yourself gently, I love you. You did the best you could do today. And even if you didn't accomplish all you had planned, I love you anyway. Jupiter-Pluto is a 12-year cycle. Here are their conjunctions. There was one in 2007, late Sag. Again, here's the 3 starting off 2020 in Capricorn. Jupiter-Pluto is the evolution of our soul, individually and collectively. They had a conjunction in Sag, so we've been on this journey to understand and evolve truth on a soul level, individually and collectively. And that will help us expose these right-wrong battles, us versus them religions, and this slow expansion into broader understandings of what we call natural laws and spiritual principles. Jupiter is going to make 3 waning sextiles to Pluto in 2018. Waning sextiles, it's the 300-degree on 360 wheel. This is prior efforts coming to fruition. Waxing sextiles are laying groundwork. Waning sextiles, here's the results of the groundwork. But it can be both good and bad. There can be economic upsets as more demand equitable rewards. Have-nots can gain or lose ground depending upon circumstances. The haves will not let it go. So again, last quarter, last quadrant of the circle, last quarter phase, waning sextile, broader and broader groups of people starting to figure out, how come you have all the money and the power and I don't have none? So even if it's a sextile, There can be power struggles. What can happen is they can try to take place in underhanded ways. For instance, all these mergers going on, Pluto and Capricorn, of these international corporations, to where we're down to just a handful of corporations that make smartphones, and we're expected to pay hundreds of dollars for a smartphone. Let me tell you something. Almost everybody in third world countries has smartphones now. They use them as their banks and currencies. They don't have hundreds of dollars to spend. We're getting ripped off. So those mergers create monopolies in what they can do with the resources and money. Will this become more extreme with the sextiles, or will it be exposed and fall apart as more and more groups figure this out and we go for power in numbers? One of my PowerPoint slides, the beginning of the year, the actions of the many can overcome the ruthless few, or something like that. I don't remember the exact words, but this is what's going on here. Briefly, I just wanted to say, for all of you Pluto and Scorpios born between 1983-84 through 1995, you're going to have 1 or 3 transits of Jupiter and Scorpio over your natal Pluto. And it's going to wake you up. It's the potential to really expand into whether you want to align with separating or returning forces in some way. It doesn't have to be outright into spirituality, just whether or not you want to self-empower for good or bad. I want to be a better person. I want to help others. I want to help myself. Now, because Jupiter's retrograde 23 to 13, those born between 1989 to 1993 are the ones that are going to have the 3 Jupiter conjunctions. You're going to get 3 chances to get this right, to really get this self-empowerment and wanting to improve yourself, or stay stuck in the mud and create even more intense lessons to grow. Now, of course, resources, money, relationships are going to be major themes for your generation. You know, the young ones getting married later and later. Some are going to get married. Some are going to get divorced. Some are going to have financial maturation lessons, or maybe even go through bankruptcy. And I got to spell bankruptcy correctly. And so I've always said that the Pluto and Scorpio generation are the recyclers of the zodiac. They have the power to either save us or destroy us. Stay tuned. These are young ones yet. You know, 84, 94, 04, 14, you know, the oldest ones are barely 30. You know, the youngest ones are 21, 22. So they're going to have to go a ways, but we'll stay tuned and watch how they come into their own power for the good of all or not as time goes by. There'll be a natural mixture of the two, but maybe they'll be the ones that mature and say enough is enough when it comes to a lone individual being able to hurt over 500 people in, you know, less than 5 minutes. Here is the chart for Las Vegas, May 15th, 1905, of course, in Vegas. Mark Penfield gave them a 10 a.m. time period. It put Mercury up here at 28 and Mercury at 30 degrees Aries. Look where Uranus is. This is the big upset right there. And look at transiting Jupiter down here. Still 1 degree orb opposition to Uranus. And, you know, for all intents and purposes, exact degree oppositions with Venus, Mercury at the top of the chart. The intensity of the violence for all the world to see. 9th, 10th house. This is somewhat of why I just think that I pray, I energize that this is the, the wake-up call that starts the turn of us looking at just the, a little bit of sense in regards to gun laws. It's going to come sooner or later. And it's going to be one of those Scorpio pendulum swings when it does. I know we've went over time. I don't need to say any more for that. If there's any comments or questions or anything, you're welcome to bring them in. I have just a couple more slides. I use the Gemini rising chart, 2:13 a.m. on July 4th. This Jupiter retrograde cycle aspects 7 natal planets in the U.S. chart, no matter which, it'll be 6 if you use the Sibley chart, because Moon is 27 Aquarius Sibley. It won't aspect that. But emotions are going to run extreme in this country through Jupiter and Scorpio. It's going to create choice points in so many areas. It's going to create resource crisis. Waxing semi-sextile Saturn, waxing sesquisquadrate Venus in Cancer, waning square to the Moon in Aquarius, a waning in conjunct to Chiron, a waxing sesquisquadrate to itself in Jupiter, a waxing in conjunct to Mars in Gemini, and a waxing sextile to Neptune. If you include Chiron, we're looking at 7 of 11 archetypes being activated 3 times with this Jupiter retrograde to the U.S. chart. That's a lot of activity. There is going to be change, expansion, and growth. We'll see if it's for the good of all or not as time goes by. I don't see how I just see us getting to such bottom lines with Jupiter and Scorpio, and we're not going to Libra fluff it off anymore. We're going to see, I'm like, how much more emotional polarity can we get in this country? Will Jupiter and Scorpio enough have the courage to just step up and start changing things? Stay tuned. Here are the hits that Jupiter makes to the U.S. chart as it does those 3 each to the planets I mentioned and a few other aspects. Okay, those are all my slides. Wednesday, October 4th, I'm going to look at Jupiter and Scorpio through all 12 houses. So thank you for bearing with me a little. I went overboard. Yeah, okay. Comments or questions from anybody? Thank you all very, very much here.
Remember that.
And thank you to those who hung in.
Just remember that the same registration link that you received from the webinar service is good for Wednesday's class. So we'll see you then, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And we'll see you in 2 nights. And I wish all of you peace in your heart and the courage to activate will, however you want to see change on planet Earth. Thank you.